how good this C63 Coupe is. Welcome back to RBR, guys, and today we are exploring the sports car motoring icon, and that is the Porsche 911. And we're going to do it in a way that can only be done at RBR. Now, the 911 is going 55 years strong, and now we've got the 8th generation of this sports car, internally designated the 992, and this is the Carrera S rear-wheel drive variant. So now you'll be able to appreciate that 55-year journey that has brought us to the 992 as I tell you the story of the 911. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm not gonna credit the VW Beetle with the design of the 911, as a lot of people will do. I'm not doing that, but I am gonna start here because this car was created by Dr. Ferdinand Porsche. And at this time, he was creating a people's car. As you can see, it is bug-eyed. It is rear engine with a rear swing axle. It does kind of look like a tall 911, but what he was trying to do was create an exceedingly cheap people's car for the evil mustache guy's Reich. Now, the Mercedes nerd in me will also want to tell you that 2 years prior to this, when he was still the chief engineer at Daimler or Mercedes-Benz, there was a car that looked very similar to this so-called revolutionary VW, and that was the 130 or the 170H Heck motor, which literally means rear engine. And it's got bug eyes with that shape. It's a Beetle. Now, Ferdinand Porsche was also the person who created the first ever car to be sold with a Porsche name tag, and that was the Porsche 356. But that wasn't the same Ferdinand Porsche. That was actually Ferdinand Porsche Jr., or better known as Ferry Porsche. And he was not setting out to create a cheap people's car. He wanted a racing car, a fast car, like his BMW he was noted to have saying. So he took all the parts that were available to him, which invariably ended up being a lot from the VW Beetle, and created this, the Porsche 356. Now, people attributing Ferry's new car to his father's old one is a little bit unfair, but the fact that they shared parts and designs is a kind of inescapable truth. Now, this 356, it started off as an all-aluminium race car concept, but eventually turned into a road-going car, and it was super successful, especially in the USA. So in 1963, Porsche began plotting a much more luxurious, a larger, a more expensive, and a more capable version of the 356, and that was to be called the Porsche 901. Now look at it. How familiar does that look to you? Just look at the silhouette. Just like our car today, it is a rear-engine, 6-cylinder, tail-happy 2+2 coupe with that classic silhouette and bug eyes, exactly as you would expect. Now, to confuse matters even further, the person who designed this car was Ferdinand Porsche. No, not Ferdinand Porsche Sr. or Ferdinand Porsche Ferry Jr., but Ferry's son, who was also called Ferdinand. Yeah, luckily they were a lot more imaginative in their cars than they were naming their children. Speaking of naming, their 911 was originally, as I said, to be called the 901, but after the Frankfurt Motor Show, when Peugeot heard of this, they filed a lawsuit claiming that every single car with digits with a 0 in the middle of it belonged to them, rather. So a big thank you to Peugeot for that, because 911 just has a much better ring to it than 901 ever will. So in 1964, Porsche began production of the first 911. And over time after that, incremental updates kept happening to make the car more powerful, more capable. So bored out a little bit more power per engine. We had different editions of the car, such as the 911S, which brought on the Fuchs wheels for the first time, which are popular even today. Stuff like the first auto box were brought in as well. But the first really big update in the series was the G model 911. And this was in reaction to crash safety standards in the USA, where you required new impact bumpers on the front end, and they had to be integrated into the design. This series was also the first to have fuel injection, but more importantly, was the first series to have a 911 turbo. A car that rocketed the 911 into supercar territory and was frankly one of the fastest cars of its time, and actually killed a lot of owners as well. So you know that it deserved respect. And of course it had that iconic now whale tail that you see right there. After this, Porsche did not intend for the 911 to continue. They wanted to replace it with a 928, which was a front engine car. But luckily for all of us, the 928 just didn't sell as well as the 911. So this series endured. Then skipping forward, we come to the next version, which was the Porsche 964. Now, although not that different visually, I'm gonna say that with every 911, it brought a lot of technological advancements. So we had ABS, power steering. We had the first four-wheel drive Carrera 4 in this car, the first Tiptronic automatic, and even luxury climate control. But the big one in terms of design followed after this, and that was the Porsche 993. Look at it. It's the first really modern looking Porsche, and it was special for a number of reasons. So this 993 was really the first big departure in terms of design. Only took them 30 years to do it. You need to give Porsche time when it comes to design. But this truly was a sweet spot. This car had a much lighter alloy design, reducing the weight. It had multi-link rear suspension, a much better four-wheel drive system for the 4 as well. And this year was the time that August Achleitner, who is today known as Mr. 911, started working for Porsche, and he would eventually be responsible from 997 till today's 992. Now this car was also very important because it was the last of the air-cooled 911s. And all the anoraks will tell you because of that, it is the last true 911. Anyway, after this came the 996, the odd one. So I'm not going to call it that. We're going to call it what it should be called, the fried egg 911, because of those hideous front lights shared with the cheaper Boxster. Whoever thought of that, shame on you. It was that paired with the fact that the air-cooled engines that everybody loved had now gone, replaced with water-cooled ones because of emissions and noise regulation. Stop me if that sounds relevant for our problems today. This car did, however, it had a more modern design, increased wheelbase to help with handling, of course more tech inside. People didn't really calm down though until Gen 2, where the lights got their own unique design. And then of course the GT variants from this time were really bombastic. But then the huge sigh of relief came in 2004 when the 997 came. And you could have heard that sigh of relief the world over as everyone screamed, "The bug-eyed lights are back!" Now the 997 brought a whole host of improvements to the 911 platform. First of all, we got PASM, the famous PASM active dampeners that are so famous today in a 911. We got direct ignition engine. We got the first PDK gearbox. We got torque vectoring. We got the first sports exhaust option. The Carrera S was introduced during this line, as was the GTS, and pressed the worldwide over. Even Jeremy Clarkson admitted to the fact that this was simply the gold standard of sports cars. And remember when I said that Mr. 911 started during this era, during the 997 era? No coincidence. So after this came the 991, the modern one. As you can see, it looks a lot more familiar to what we're looking at today. And again, this brought a lot of advancements. So the 991 grew the 911 in length significantly. That was obviously to give more space and more room for tech inside, but it was more about getting those rear wheels further back to help with the weight balance of the car. Apart from that, the actual weight of the car dropped compared to the previous generation, which is a rare thing. And that was done thanks to clever use of light alloys. And this Carrera S version had that 3.8 litre naturally aspirated engine that was just a beautiful unit that sounded so good and revved all the way to 8,000. But, and there's always a but with new 911s, as you're seeing a trend, this car is where the hydraulic steering vanished and it was replaced with electric steering, which took a long time for people to get used to. Although the GT variants did have lovely rear wheel steering, which wasn't as common back then. Again, some great technical innovations coming via 911. Then we had the facelift. Very much nip-tuck as you would expect on the design, but, and again a but, gone with the naturally aspirated engines that everybody loved so much, replaced with a full turbo range except for the GT3 car. Of course that means more torque, more power, but it does mean less noise. But of course the GT variants of this time, absolutely legendary, aren't they? Then after this, the one we're looking at today, the 992, the 8th generation. Now the first thing I must point out that whereas in the past, the two-wheel drive cars had a narrow body and the four-wheel drive cars and the GTs had the wider body, now there is only a wide body. So this Carrera S rear-wheel drive shares the wide body with its four-wheel drive counterpart. Now, the other thing that people get worried about with a completely new car is it growing in size. But I'm pleased to tell you that the actual footprint and wheelbase of this car has not deterred from the 991, certainly not in length or height in any meaningful way, maybe a few millimeters here and there. But where it has changed is the front end. We've got a 45 millimeter wider track on the front, and it's something you really notice, and I think it's something that the 991 was missing a bit in presence, especially compared to some competitors. So that looks really good. But now that we've come to the front, I absolutely must draw your attention to a few other areas of the design. Let's start with the bonnet. Now, when you look at the bonnet of the 991, it's a rounded bonnet, kind of like you have in all the other modern Porsches. The 992 has gone back to the design of the original, the G model, the 993. It's got a square bonnet. And that makes a big difference. It looks a lot more retro 911. Not only that, look at this scoop in the middle of the bonnet. And let me show you what that looked like in the previous cars. You can see it's identical to those. Again, hearkening back to those cars. If we're gonna go back, if we're gonna look like our previous cars, let's do it properly. Then you look at the lights. And again, I'm gonna show you a previous generation car where you will notice these lines within the headlamp unit also existing back then. Again, a really nice link. Then you'll see we've got active aero on the front here, where the aero flaps open depending on your driving style. All in all, the front looking very, very classic 911, but modern just in the right way, nice and intimidating. You'll note larger wheels, but these are actually a staggered setup, and they are 2021s, which is big. And it's the first time we got staggered setup in a non-GT 911. Apart from that, this car has also got the PASM Sport chassis, which drops the height of the car by 10 millimeters, again, giving it a really nice stance. You come along the side, it's the same silhouette that you always expect, and you'll notice a nice change with the door handles being completely flush against the door. They open when I press the key, but they're not actually as useful in real life compared to the previous ones. The rear is really where you'll recognize the 992 compared to the previous car. And we'll start off with the big wing. Now, this wing is about 45% bigger, and it doesn't just have on or off stage. There are multiple stages, which depends on how you are driving, what mode you have the car in, so it's a lot more dynamic, and its general shape and size helps with the cooling of the engine as well. Then you'll note the long light strip, which is becoming part of all the modern Porsches. Now, again, this links to previous 911s, even the fact that you've got Porsche written in the light strip, but here we've got it done in a much more modern way. I think it looks stunning. Then you've got the 911, the thick 911 typography badge, which I love it. It looks so retro. You'll notice the oval pipes. Now, these are from the sports exhaust. The non-sport exhaust car gets the ugly quad pipes, which I don't like the look of. These look really, really good, and they look quite intimidating. But my favorite part on the rear has to be the engine cover. You're asking why? Normally, it's not really the highlight of a 911, but there are some really cool little design notes in here. First of all, you look at the brake light. It looks like a pause symbol. Of course, braking is pausing. But then I read something on Instagram by Design 911 that pointed out another detail. Now look, the pause light also looks like the numbers 11. Let's count the bars next to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It says 911. Who else comes out with these details other than Porsche? Mind-blowing. For the first time ever, all of the outer shell of the car is completely made of aluminium, apart from the front and rear crumple zones. And it's not just that. Before, the steel usage was 60%. That's down to 30% in this car. So some real innovations in alloy use going on here. Now, there is a sport design version of the body kit available. I don't really like the look of that. I prefer the way that this car looks now. Of course, there are a multitude of different alloy choices that you can have and specs, etc. As with every 911, there are technological advancements. So let's talk about some of those and the performance. Let's start with the engine. So the engine is that same turbocharged flat six from the 991.2, but it has more power now. It's got 444 brake horsepower, and we've got that out of larger turbochargers now in this engine, which are mirrored rather than exactly the same and spin in different directions, which is more efficient. It reduces lag as well. The air coolers have now moved as well. Previously they were above the wheel arches, they now sit on top of the engine to help with the cooling aspect. Unfortunately, we have got the GPF filter in this car, the gas particle filter, which is coming into every single new performance and otherwise car. That of course has affected the sound, and it's added 15 kg worth of weight, but luckily the performance is unaffected. Apart from that, we've got a brand new 8-speed PDK. Now this is quite interesting more for the future, because the size of this gearbox, although a little bit heavier, allows for the implementation of hybrids should Porsche want to do it. So one day maybe we'll see some type of hybrid 911 in this generation. The brakes have been uprated as well. We've got larger brakes on the rear. The direct steering has been modified, so it's got even better steering now. And for the first time, we can get rear wheel steer on a standard 911 as well. And finally, something really interesting is we have got road wetness detectors in the front arches. There's actually sound sensors which pick up the spray, the sound of a wet road, and then suggest to you to use the brand new wet mode. Really clever stuff. Now, as we're going through the specs, you guys have probably noticed that a lot has come out of the previous gen's GT product to make the standard 911 more formidable. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to you, because the successor to Mr. 911 is Frank Stefan Walliser, who is the current head of GT product. Now, this is a great sign for 911 fans and customers, because it means that the standard 911 and the GT product are going to become more and more intertwined as time goes on. Now, speaking of time, speaking of the future, and speaking of GT product, we all joke about how the 911 has more variants than some car manufacturers have models. And that's going to be no different. This is just the beginning, and it's a formidable start. So of course, the Cabriolet has already been shown to us, but you can expect in the future a Targa, probably a GTS. The Turbo has been seen doing very, very fast laps. And of course, you will get the GT product. What is that going to look like? Probably something like this, probably something a lot better than I could imagine. But one good thing that I have heard, it's only a rumor, but maybe this generation of GT3 will still maintain the naturally aspirated engine. Let's cross everything we have for that, guys. Now, the inside is a place where you don't need a petrol head like me to point out the differences, because things are very, very different. So let's head inside and let me show you the truly stunning interior of the new 992. So guys, here we are inside the new 911, and as I said, the changes are a lot more obvious. But to show how evolutionary it still is, let's go back and compare certain areas to the previous generations of 911. First of all, the driver zone, which is so important, as I always say. And in 911 fashion, the driver zone always has 5 circles since the first generation. And you see that in this new car as well, but instead now we have got 2 digital screens on each side which mimic the round circles, and you can change those to whatever you want to display there, including navigation, including your modes, etc. But most crucially, you maintain the analog screen in the middle, which is so important for 911 fans. You must have that gorgeous watch-looking analog screen in the middle. But now if I compare this to, say, the G model car, you'll see it's identical. Let's compare it then to the 993. Again, the exact same format. What about the 997? Or its predecessor, the 991? In every single car, the driver zone is signature 911. That doesn't change. But it's not just that. Look at the dash and the center console. Let's compare those in the previous generations as well. Again, G model. Then let's look at the 993 and the 997 and the 991. Again, you see it in every single iteration. The shapes are being maintained. But now really what you want to see is the unique details of this. What I found really interesting as an overarching point is how the packaging has been done. And when we talk about packaging, it's about how you literally package the technology and the interior components in a car. So the way that it's been done in the new 911, you'll see a lot of cuts and a lot of kind of spaces that are cut into, and that is very tight packaging. Porsche have gone out of their way to make sure that everything is as condensed as possible to give us, the driver and the passengers, that much more feeling of an airy interior, and it really works. But it doesn't just work in that sense. Because you've got so many angular cuts and lines, it looks super modern in here. It looks, I can't explain to you, perhaps you need to sit in it to really judge how lovely this front dashboard is. It looks amazing. Then you look at the little details. There's a number of things that are repeated constantly throughout here. The first thing you'll notice is a big change is the gear selector. Gone is the longer stalk that you could hit this way and move into manual mode. I really like that one personally. But this looks good when you start to notice how it links into other parts of the interior. Specifically, yes, you've got this one. Then you've got its 3 kids behind it here, which are the temperature knobs. And then up here in the shortcut section with your hazard lights, your ESP off, your suspension, and your 2 shortcuts, again, in the same kind of design. Even your air vents have that same design. And when I look at that, it kind of reminds me of the shape of the rear of the 911. So I think you've got a bit of the external design seeping in here, which is nice. Speaking of the vents, these look better than any other 911 ever have. Partly because of how they seem like they're floating thanks to the way that this center console has been cleverly designed, but even the ones on the side, they look very nice. Again, I like the use of texture. There's lots of different texture here. I like this texture in the dashboard that hits against the smoothness of the Napa leather, and then particularly in this crayon gray interior. There's so many different shades going on. It really gives it a contrast and a vibrance so you can appreciate all these different shapes. And I do appreciate how the center console has a lack of buttons that we always used to criticize the 911 about. One thing I'm very sad about, however, maybe it's a sad thing to note, but I miss the double cup holders that used to be here. Let me show them to you. They were great, and now you've got one that's really quite far away over here. It's designed nicely, but it's only good for the passenger. The driver's only got this section here to kind of play with. I'm not going to go too much over the system. If you want to see that in more depth, have a look at my Panamera review, which I'll leave a link for. The steering wheel I love. I think it's simply one of the best steering wheels in the whole world. Really small diameter, that same design that originated in the 918 Spider hypercar. Now, one thing Porsche have not let go of, thank God, is the 2+2 seating arrangement. Now, a lot of people poo-poo this, but most people swear by it, because if you're a family person, you've got small kids, or you just want to put a little bit of luggage in the back, it's so useful. This car has got ISOFIX in the rear, so viably, if you have 2 children, the 911 can slot into your lifestyle. And we're going to talk more about daily usability later. Recently went to the McLaren GT launch, for example, where they very proudly stated that they don't have 2 occasional seats. For me, it's a big loss if you do that. And that's why the 911 maintains its very unique position in the sports car market. But now I want to show you what the car sounds like, as always. Now, it's a bit weird. When you look at a sports car and you've got modes such as normal, sport, sport plus, you're always going to expect sport plus to be the loudest, right? So if I start the car in sport plus, and then we give it some revs, there's no character there at all. But if you go into sport, you actually get some nice burbling and some pops and bangs, which is so weird because everyone, I think, would come into a car like this, go to Sport Plus, expect it to sound amazing. But trick for you guys, Sport sounds better, and you're gonna see that when we go on the drive now as well. So let's go, let's see what this new generation, this 8th generation of 992 is like when you drive it really fast. There's a nice start to proceedings. That was a launch control in Sport Plus. How fast was that? How did Porsche get such good grip out of rear-wheel drive cars? Well, the 305 massive cross-section rear tyres obviously help. The engine position being mid-rear obviously helps. You got that much of the weight at the rear of the car. And it's Porsche. They're just bloody good at traction. So we're going to switch things around a bit in today's review. Normally, I would start off by talking about the performance. Today, we're going to talk first about the daily usability of this new 992. Because over the years, the Porsche 911 has spawned so many alleged competitors. You know, you've got the R8, the AMG GT, you've got the F-Type, Aston's Vantage, and sometimes completely nonsensical comparisons like the new 8 Series. But you see, the thing is, there's no real rival to the 911 because this car is as dynamic, if not more, than the aforementioned cars, but it maintains that 2+2 seating arrangement that the others think is a weakness. But I'm sorry, none of those can match this for practicality. Then you look at how Porsche have taken it even further in the 992. So their PASM active dampeners now have a wider breadth of ability. So when you're in normal, your comfort is even more comfortable. It's more able to deal with bigger bumps and smaller things like stones and pebbles. But when you go into the more dynamic chassis mode, into sport, it becomes that much more glued to the road, especially with the extra sport suspension that we have in this car. So if you imagine a scale of comfort to sportiness, before there was this much in between them, now there's a much larger gap in between comfort and sport. It just means that this car has more breadth of ability than it's ever had. I mean, just look now, we're in normal mode and we're just cruising along at 70 miles an hour and there's hardly any vibrations, there's not that much road noise. It's a pretty decent experience for a sports car. Plus, if you get the dynamic engine mounts, then they're mounted, as we said, further along the car, and it helps in reducing any vibrations getting into the car as well. This is, of course, an 8-speed PDK now, and your final drive ratio is longer. And what that basically means is in the latter gears, there's less engine speed, and thus more comfort. The other innovation we talked about earlier was the wetness detector for the road. And that links to wet mode. Now, wet mode is quite interesting. You get the detection thanks to the acoustics in the front arches that we mentioned, but then it comes up on here as an option, and it doesn't only use throttle remapping, it also uses the aero and all the other information available to the car to make it safer. The seating position is perfect. You can get really low. If you're tall, you're going to have loads of headroom. I'm 5'10", I've got loads of headroom here. It's just a really comfortable car. That paired with this awesome new interior and the space in the back, it's brilliant for daily driving. So sound, as we said earlier, it's all a bit lopsided. Normally you'd go straight to Sport Plus on a car like this, but you'll note it just screams. If I kind of downshift now, you don't get any pop bangs, any crackles, no real emotional sound. And Sport Plus is much more of a track mode. It's kind of all business and no pleasure, very efficient on fuel, you know, not wasting anything. But you go into sport instead, then you just get a much nicer exhaust note. Can you hear that? It sounds really quite good. So we're in sport and manual mode. I'm going to go through the gears to give you some of the sound. And you can hear it sounds very traditional 911. It sounds really good. It reminds me of that Carrera S tune from the 991 that I had, but obviously it's kind of owning the whole turbocharging thing a bit more. You get more essence of that air intake noise. It sounds a lot better than I thought it would. It revs all the way to 7,500 as well. That plus the little emotional sounds you get from it. Very exciting to drive fast and slow, and that's what I want. I recently drove the facelifted Audi R8 V10, and it's got the OPF filter and it's a muffled V10 with hardly any pops and bangs. This sounds as good as that. And that's how good of a job Porsche have done with the flat six, despite the GPF being in this car. Also remember guys, everything that you're hearing at the moment is the sports exhaust option that this car has. So it's an absolute must for the new 911 to get sports exhaust, because of course, volume-wise it is quieter than both previous generations of the 991. So if you want any of this that we have right now, you need to get the sport exhaust system. It's not something that you can do without if you're into sound, which I'm sure every 911 driver is. Now let's talk about performance. The notable figure for me is the torque compared to the 991 first generation that I had. that car only had 440 Newton meters of torque. This car's got 530, all available in the lower end. Now, as we said, the power's up to 444, but it feels so much more powerful than that. I don't know what it is. It must be the power to weight ratio of this car. It's so rapid, it's so fast. Rarely have I been on these roads with anything that feels this quick. And this is just the normal Carrera S rear-wheel drive. Versus the Gen 2 of the 991, you're not really going to notice the horsepower that much. What you do notice, however, is the gearbox. Let me explain. We mentioned that the final drive ratio is longer, but the other thing that they've done is shorten the ratio of the first gear. So if we take off now, you get a lot more gear shifts and some of that 7,500 RPM drama before you hit your national speed limit. And that just makes the car feel that much more frantic, that much faster. And of course, the 0 to 60 of this car has improved. With the Sport Chrono package in this car, it's even better by 0.2, as we said earlier. But something else in this updated gearbox is straight out of the GT 911s, and that is lightning quick gear changes under heavy load and speeds, and that's in manual mode or in Sport Plus. So we're getting, as we said earlier, more from the GT cars into the standard 911s, and you feel it when you're going fast. Now, the other thing you get with Sport Chrono package is the drive mode select, but that comes with Sport Response mode, which is 20 seconds of full attack power, like this. It's completely unnecessary, but it's so fun to have that button there. But when you're cruising around town, you want 20 seconds of all-out power, the car gives it to you. Now, let's talk about handling, which is where the 911 simply rules supreme, okay? And Sport Chrono package. Now, all the other bits are quite nice, fair enough, but the most important bit are the dynamic engine mounts, because they help manage the main weight of the car and really just change the handling. So there's an option you need to tick, guys. It's Sport Chrono package for the dynamic engine mounts and the Sport exhaust. It just makes for an epic handling experience. But then we have to come on to steering, which was a bugbear for me in Gen 1 991. But this electronic steering is so bloody good. I have to say, it is the best that I've ever experienced in any car in the modern car world. The feedback is brilliant. The extra width we get, I appreciate. I know not a lot of 911 owners will be used to that direct feel of the turn-in, but I love it because you get the feedback when it's turning as well, which a lot of cars just don't do. See, pointiness is something you get in the new 8 Series as well, but it's useless like in that car if it comes after you've turned. This tells you exactly where the wheels are. There's no delay in feedback or feeling. That's what you need as a driver. It builds confidence. You just drive faster and faster and you push the car in the grip. Oh, the grip. It's like a four-wheel drive car. There's hardly any oversteer or understeer in this. The brakes really feel numb to you initially, and the pedal length is definitely shorter, but then you get used to it over time and you realize when you're driving more dynamically just how much feedback you're getting. So despite being an electric system, they're actually very, very good. You know what? This is simply one of the best handling cars that I've ever driven. It's just so fun to drive through corners. I have to confess, I caught myself doing the figures the other day on this car, seeing if I could axe another car or fit this into my life somehow. It's just that kind of car. I think for so many people, it could just enter your life and become a part of it because it's so usable and it's so desirable because it's just a bloody good driver's car. The 2+2 setup, the amazing breadth of ability of the adaptive suspension. Yes, you lose luggage space compared to some cars, but I'd rather kick out the luggage than our lovely small humans who deserve a space in the car. And as far as performance goes, it's always been the benchmark, and it still is. Regardless of all the laws that have come in from the EU, Porsche have taken it as a challenge instead and simply just improved the 911 even further. Yes, I do miss the sound from my 991 first gen, but in this brave new world, tuners are going to be called upon more and more for better sound. Plus, this is only the beginning of 992. I'm sure the GTS and the future Turbo and GT variants are going to sound very, very exciting. Porsche market the new 911 in the most honest way by saying, when we look to the future, we see ourselves looking back. And it's the most fitting statement for perhaps what is the most evolutionary car ever. Every generation so intertwined, predecessors who by the laws of physics should never have succeeded, but stand still today as the gold standard of the sports car. And you know what the scary thing is? This Carrera S, it's just the beginning. So guys, I hope you enjoyed that review on the new 992. Please do like and subscribe and share the video if you did. Normally I'd shoot off into the distance with a performance car, but with this one, I think I'll cut up some more corners. See you next time.